back, everybody, to another episode of Making Monsters. I'm Taylor Dahl, and you probably know Khari Thompson, also a part of Windy City Gridiron. We are here to talk a bunch of stuff, actually. We got some big news today, Khari, which possibly pivots some of the decisions that the Bears make for the rest of free agency and in the draft. But let's start with number one. Thank you for hopping on. Number two, how was the combine? Did you have a ton of fun and come back with learning all sorts of different stuff?
I thank you very much for having me on. For one thing, I did have a good time at the combine. I'd been there before in 2022, met a whole new cast and crew of people this time around. I'm looking forward to seeing them down the line. And yeah, I think the cool thing about this round was that I hadn't gone to see the workouts when I went in 2022. I'd only stuck around the interviews. And this time I went to the field each day of the workouts, except for the offensive line, had to come back home for that. But it was such an experience seeing it live, and kind of the same thing with being at training camp or being at a game where you can see and feel things differently when you're watching it in person. So it was enlightening to me, even if it was just t-shirts and shorts.
Yeah. The energy level of it is definitely different. And I think just being at the combine and hearing different people talk, you hear so many different takes and reports and thoughts, and it makes you kind of expand also of what you've been thinking and feeling on certain things. But let's start with the big news this week. Obviously, the Bears announced two big moves when it comes to Joe Thuney and Jonah Jackson. So two offensive linemen already. Both have, I think, a lot more people a little bit more excited about the Thuney. They may be more familiar with him than Jonah Jackson. And then obviously the Jonah Jackson coming off an injury too. But let's start there. Your thoughts on both of those guys and the offensive line, what they can add without even anything else happening yet.
Well, for one thing, I think it tells you that the Bears didn't necessarily think they were going to be able to massively upgrade those positions in free agency. Maybe they really wanted Trey Smith, and then they saw that Trey Smith was going to get the franchise tag. And just generally, right, good teams don't let good players walk for nothing. You got to sometimes go out and get them. And Ryan Poles has shown over the past couple of years, he does not care about dealing day 3 picks. He does not care about 6th rounders, 5th rounders, none of it. If he thinks that he can get a starter on the cheap, bam, there you go. And when the Jonah Jackson trade happened, I thought, oh, maybe this is an interesting swing guy, because I wasn't familiar with his contract situation at that time. And maybe, a reliable starter when possible. But at that cap hit, you're thinking, okay, that's probably a starter on your offensive line. And he's generally been a solid starter when healthy. Health has been his issue. And generally been, when he struggled to stay on the field, when he's battling through injuries, or when he struggled the most. And then you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, that's probably your starting left guard. And then they went and traded for Joe Thuney. That's your starting left guard. No debates about that one. I mean, that's a future Hall of Famer right there. All pro, just all around solid player. He was here so I'm located in Boston right now. He was here when I started out here in Boston, obviously, as a member of those Super Bowl teams, those later Super Bowl teams with the New England Patriots. I mean, just, a very, very steady, reliable player, and somebody who showed he could kick out to tackle when you really needed.
Yeah.
But that's your starting left guard. You've, in theory, got your starting right guard. Now you get your center, and this is an entirely different offensive line. And I think what's interesting about this, just to wrap up this point, I think it's intriguing how the Bears saw their offensive line situation. A lot of people talked about got to upgrade Braxton Jones, and there's a chance that you could do that. But perhaps what they're saying is, you know what, maybe we could, or maybe we could get some better guard play next to him, and he'll be even better off for it. And now your tackles in that case are set. You're fine with that. You got 2 young, cheap tackles, and you can just focus on the interior now.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of been my argument this whole last couple months with the Braxton. I think most people are like Darnell Wright. I don't think I see many people that don't like Darnell Wright, but the Braxton one is a little more controversial of if he is a starting left tackle at that caliber in the NFL. And I think we've seen both. We've seen that he can be, and we've seen moments where we're like, oh, like the bull rush still, he struggles against the bull rush still. He gets pushed back into the lap of Caleb, Justin, whoever, quite a bit. But I also, to your point, think there's been a revolving door of guys beside him, and it's really hard to really get that grounding and any sort of cohesiveness, which is all what the offensive line is about. If you're playing by a different person at the left guard constantly. And I know when Tevin's out there, Tevin's great, but there's been a lot of time that Tevin hasn't been out there, or Tevin's had to move somewhere else. And we've seen guys all over the place. So to your point, I do think that maybe they think if they fix that interior, then, and they add into that interior, then Darnell Wright and Braxton Jones will be just fine. And so that will be, I do think at this point, it looks like that's the direction they're going. And the interior was a problem last year. So being able to say, hey, you addressed two guys and free agency hasn't even started yet, definitely feels like they have a little bit of an up on that. But for you, when you're talking about that now, Khari, what happens now? Like, what does the rest of this, because I think it changes a little bit about the draft now, because a lot of the names we were seeing at that 10 were offensive linemen, and whether that be a Will Campbell falling to them recently, Armand Membeau moving up to them. We've seen some of those things. So what happens now at 10 if offensive lineman seems to be off the board?
I would say it's probably not off the board, but what this does is it means that you don't necessarily have to draft purely for need. You don't have to get a tackle now. This is one thing I talked with a bunch of coaches and scouts about this, and they're like, look, people talk about tackle play not being good. Sometimes you got to look at the guard play. The guard play can elevate tackle play. So if you don't feel like you have to upgrade Braxton Jones this year, obviously you got decisions coming up whether you want to keep him long term or not, or whether you want to get a rookie to replace him. Obviously those are conversations, but you're not looking at it now like, I've got to get a tackle at number 10. You don't have to do that now. So I would say, look, Will Campbell, if he falls, I would have that on the table, though. I think some of the concerns about arm length and wingspan are going to be there. He might be better off playing in a phone booth. Obviously he's very, very athletic, so he has the feet and all that stuff to maybe compensate for some of that, but you wonder about the upside at tackle. Membeau, obviously, like you dig into his film a little bit more, and he looks like a guy who kind of has the total package. There's also somebody that, honestly, the shocker of the week for me was hearing Josh Simmons of Ohio State say that he's going to try and work out for teams before the draft, like 6 months after, tearing his like patellar tendon or ACL, whatever the serious knee injury was. And like, oh yeah, I'm going to try and work out for a mid-April pro day. What? I mean, if he does, if he does that and he looks good, I'm not sure about 10. We'll see. But I mean, that is an athletic freak at tackle. And I'd be very intrigued by that. But I want to get to the big point that everybody is really looking at here, which is, what is the possibility of Ashton Jeanty coming to the Bears at number 10 overall? Look, I've said multiple times this week that the Bears, under Ryan Poles, have been very focused on very focused on premium positions with their first picks in the draft. Even going back to 2022, when their first pick was a second rounder, they got Kyler Gordon, a cornerback, premium position. Then they address tackle, they address quarterback, they address wide receiver. It's looking prime, like, they might be looking at edge. But the question is, who's going to be there? I've heard guys like James Pierce Jr. and Mike Green might not be options at 10 for, or that high because of character reasons. I like Michael Williams. I think he might be the best of that crop, but he's young. He's got a lot of growing still to do, even though he's already good. Shamar Stewart obviously tested like an absolute monstrosity at the combine, but there's like no sack production. So you're like, is that just a total projection? There's a chance that you're looking at it at number 10 and saying, what if Ashton Jeanty is the best player available at that point? And the fact that, especially if you get a veteran center or, trade for one or whatever happens, if you address that position and then you shored up your guards, your entire interior, that sets up a move that could say that's not crazy. And on top of that, you don't have to pay that position very much. You have a very cheap backfield offensively. You've still got some affordable talent on the outside with Rome Odunze, and then you can focus some assets later on your defense and getting more interior offensive linemen for developmental purposes. Like, I think it's possible.
Yeah, I know. Me too. And all of a sudden, these two moves really did shift me, because I've had this conversation now for weeks, whether it be on podcasts, whether it be with just friends talking about what the Bears may do. And all of them asked that. Do you see a world where Ashton Jeanty is that pick at 10? And 2 weeks ago, I was like, I just don't. I feel like you have to, now I could truly, with the way that this is set up, see that. And I will say I've fallen in love with Jared Wilson. And I wish that there was a possibility. I just don't see a world where that's able to happen. But I like somebody like that. I would love to maybe see a center out of the draft still, and then maybe a little bit later. And then to that point, you still are you have so many options at 10 when it comes to, do you take a guy like Ashton Genty? Do they make another crazy splash move, a name we've seen move up to, even I've seen possibly being drafted at 5 is Tet McMillan? And do they go another wide receiver in some form or fashion? Like, that's a name that's climbed suddenly.
Tet McMillan is such an interesting one because I think I left the combine feeling like this weirdly polarized energy toward him. There's some people like, like he doesn't really like love football, love the competition that much. I don't know if he wants to be that guy. And then you hear things like, he had has this tested like this crazy aptitude score, like he's just like a brainiac in terms of football. And obviously, like, people say, oh well, he didn't run the 40, so we don't know if he's fast. Like, turn on the tape, man. Like, he's got long strides, and he's not like going 0 to 60 like that, but he gets the ball in the open field, he can stride it out and make some big plays. That's a thing that you got to not get too caught up in when it comes to 40-yard dashes. A fast 40-yard dash or fast straight line speed can look different. You got guys that are cooking out of the blocks and that they're going to be, put up a fast time. There are guys that look like they're not moving at the start, and then by the time they get to the end, they're like, word, he ran that fast, because they build up. Tet McMillan is one of those long strider, like kind of long speed-ish kind of guys. I think he won't run quite as fast as, say, Roma Dunze did, but, in that way, they're kind of similar-ish kinds of players. I think the other option here is, depending on who's on the board at that time, maybe the Bears do a small trade back and try to recoup a little bit of value and still find a player that they really like. Because one thing you're going to hear a lot about this draft is that it's not superstar heavy. There are a lot of really good players that could potentially be starting caliber. And in that case, you might say, you know what? Let's go ahead and trade back like 3 or 4 spots and grab like an extra third or, 4th or something like that. Give us another bite at the apple. Oh, and by the way, maybe Ashton Genty's still there. Or, maybe insert edge or tackle prospect or whatever is still there. Real quick, one last guy. You mentioned centers that you really like. One guy that I was kind of caught by in terms of interior offensive lineman was Joshua Gray out of Oregon State.
Yeah.
So again, or his former Oregon State offensive line coach is now on the Chicago Bears staff, and you just listen to the guy talk, and he just seems like a consummate professional. He just seems like a guy who is going to play a long time in this league. He's going to be employed, and he's played guard. He started off as a tackle, played guard last year. He's learning center right now, and he's like studying guys like Creed Humphrey, which is like the alarm bells are going off in your head. That
you're like,
this is the kind of guy the Bears might like.
Yeah. It's funny because so obviously there's so many connections between the Bears and the Jags, and it's been a thing now for this whole entire season and off season and I cover both teams. People that listen know that. And so the connections of obviously the Ian Cunningham stuff, the Ben Johnson in the beginning, certain players. Now you do a little swap of Shane Waldron and Press Taylor. There's so many things that line up between the two teams. And another thing of that is the offensive line needs. So we did on our show yesterday, like 3 offensive linemen that we would like to see in Jacksonville, which I could still correlate this with in Chicago, honestly. And it was Jared Wilson. Joshua Gray was my other one. And then I say Jonah Arizona because I literally have tried so hard to say his last name and I struggle.
Like Saganaya.
And so those 3 were the names. So it's funny that you say Joshua Gray because he is somebody that I talked a lot about on our show yesterday of liking him, that you could get in a little bit later in the draft probably. And so speaking of that later in the draft thing, because Ashton Genty obviously is the running back we're talking about, but this running back class is good. And there's a lot of names they're going to be talking about. So that's why I think some people are a little hesitant because they do believe you can get a running back in 2nd, 3rd, maybe even 4th round that you're still counting on making immediate impact. Which ones do you like? Who is your next behind Genty for you?
So I think you're going to see a lot of Omarion Hampton, which is a guy that I liked even just watching him play alongside Drake May. So I mentioned I'm out here in Boston, right? So I kind of had that same little Patriots Bears kind of like there's a lot
Yeah.
of overlap between their needs at this particular point in time as well. Omarion Hampton was a guy I think that tested really well. I think he had like a 10-foot, 10-inch broad jump. He ran like 4.47 in the 40. I wasn't in love with his pass catching necessarily, but he got the job done. He didn't drop the ball, right? I
Yeah.
think it's just that he's working on some of the vision stuff and some of the route running and kind of the refined pieces of his game. But you see the guy, he's explosive.
Yeah.
He's powerful. You can see him ripping off big plays. And I think that in terms of value, right? If you're looking at a guy like Ashton Genty and you're thinking, I got to give this guy the ball a bunch of times. Hampton has been that complementary piece for a really good young quarterback before when he was with Drake May in college. And I could see that relationship working out with Caleb Williams for sure. I also look for me, I don't know that this would be a guy that the Bears absolutely would draft, but I think Trevor Etienne from Georgia was basically perfect. Like when you watch this guy play, when he on the field with the route running, the cuts, just everything is just, he's such a polished, just solid running back all the way around. Look, that's totally a guy that somebody's going to get in the second or third round, and he's just going to come in and start making plays. Like that's a good player to me. The Ohio State guys, I heard a lot of people going back and forth about the Ohio State guys. Obviously, Travion Henderson, was the guy that ran faster, but I think a lot of people told me they think Quinshon Judkins is going to be better. Okay. And both of them had solid days. I think Judkins had, especially, an explosive combine. I would be really interested in Judkins in particular being a possible day 2 guy if they don't go with Genty. And then for late guys, one guy that I found really intriguing because he's kind of got that almost Matt Forte-ish sort of skill set and body type. Marcus Yarns out of Delaware, like FCS player and all, but catches the ball and runs wide receiver routes. Like this guy, he's a pass catching dual threat kind of guy. I think he's even a little bit more explosive than Forte, though he's not kind of as big and sturdy and solid. But if you're looking for a late round guy that could low key be a steal in third round situations, or just I want to get the ball in this guy's hands and let him do stuff.
Yeah.
Marcus Yarns might be something to think about.
Hey, that's honestly a name I haven't really heard anybody say, so I'm going to look more into that. But it's funny, the Forte thing, I had someone telling me that's kind of a little bit of the vibes they get from a Caleb Johnson. So it's funny that you say the Forte, but because someone mentioned him and I was like, well, he looked kind of slow, honestly. I don't know if we want. Do you think his stock dropped a lot after the draft? I mean, after the combine?
See, I think the good thing about playing running back is you could say, maybe it dropped a little, but in the end, everybody knows what kind of player he is. Yeah. Right. So I think that people might say, it was like 4.58 or something with his 40. Like it's not necessarily great. Maybe he's not a big time home run hitter. Maybe he's a little bit more like Jordan Howard-esque than say a Matt Forte-esque, but that's still a guy who can play in the NFL and be a productive running back. And so I think whoever gets Caleb Johnson is still going to be getting a good player. I just think it was one of those things that with time, right, people are saying like, Caleb Johnson might be your real RB1 in this class, instead of Ashton Genty. Look at the numbers they're putting up. And then as time went on, they're kind of like, one of these things is not like the other.
Yeah, we were having that argument a lot, like in season about, on air. We're like, why are we paying so much attention to Ashton and not giving Caleb Johnson the love? And I'm like, please go watch Ashton Genty a full game because it's insane.
How many more 70-yard runs and like breaking 5 tackles on a play? How many more of those do we need to see? I don't know.
And like, I feel like one name people don't talk enough about, honestly, in the running back room, to me, if we're talking just full on like bowling ball run people over running backs is Cam Scatabo. Like watching that guy just drill and run over these massive, whether it's a linebacker, defensive lineman, he has like 3 safeties hanging on him and he's still just going for 15, 20 yards. And he's fantastic when it comes to seeing that. But I don't think that's the type of back that Chicago will be looking for. Khari, before we, a couple more before I let you go, I want to switch over to the defensive line because obviously that's another thing that we are going to be talking about a lot here in Chicago. Not only the pass rush, that's something that we know needs to be addressed in general, whether that's from the interior, the edge. I think I like Javon Dexter. I'm a big Javon Dexter fan. I think he is a major foundational piece of building this team. I love Andrew Billings, but I do think you have to start kind of figuring some things out beyond that. And so there's some guys that I really like out of this. I want to get your name on some of your thoughts on some of these, but also if you have any other names. Darius Alexander, I like a lot. Obviously, he's out of Toledo. Another one, Walter Nolan, I like out of Ole Miss. I think another name that people say talk a lot about, and that's mainly because the Mason Graham conversation kind of overshadows it a little bit, but Kenneth Grant obviously is another name. And then Aeneas Peebles is another one to me that I remember going back to the Senior Bowl and seeing some of the things he was doing against the Gray Zabel and some of those guys that we were talking about. So those are some of the names I like, kind of all guys from some of them higher up, some maybe more 3rd, 4th round. But thoughts on those and any other names you like that you could see on the defensive line?
Darius Alexander was one of the first guys I noticed. His first step is explosive. Like I remember watching him in some of the drills. And again, like, it's not in pads, et cetera, but you can just kind of tell sometimes when a guy moves different. And Darius Alexander was coming off the, ball on a stick. He's coming off different. And he's definitely providing some heavy punch. Like I love the way he moved. He ran, like a 4.96 40-yard dash. Aeneas Peebles, he's just like a little bowling ball. Like right? He's kind of he's like undersized, right? So I think currently he's checking in under 300 pounds. But particularly if you're talking about this kind of scheme where it can rely on quickness and leverage like that, I think somebody like Aeneas Peebles could be interesting. I don't know if he's necessarily going to fit the archetype, but I loved watching him out there. He was out there moving for sure. Kenneth Grant, from Gary, Indiana, local boy. I mean, listen,
we know Poles likes to go after the locals.
Exactly. And listen, being, living in Gary, spent a lot of time there back in the day. I would absolutely love that. Interestingly, on Mullen, I had heard from some people that they thought that he was going to slide a little bit. Maybe it was because some of the other good depth that was, kind of creeping up, in particular, because of Grant. I mean, I've heard people say that they think Kenneth Grant should be a top 10 pick. And I don't know that that's going to happen. Right. Yeah. But I've talked to some people and hung out with some people that were very high on Kenneth Grant. So maybe that's like at the, at Mullen's expense. But in terms of a couple of later guys, or at least one later guy that I like, that might be more of a day 2, high day 3 pick, CJ West. Out of Indiana. I thought he just had a really solid workout. And again, it wasn't even necessarily that like all of it wowed you, but it was just like, obviously good run, good movement at that size. I liked, they do the hoop drill, right? And I think the commonality of the best performers was that they showed really good bend on those drills for big guys. And they weren't scared of it at all. They were able to get low and change direction. And again, I feel like if you're in somebody like West, I think is the sort of guy who's got that, maybe one technique body, but in a 40 front, in an even front situation, you love guys to be able to play 1 and 3 technique and be able to move them around. And I feel like that's actually one thing that, Javon Dexter, in his best form, that's what he can do. I heard a lot of people say they thought that he should have been a one technique in his first season. And now he's obviously developing into, a scary 3 technique. But I think having somebody like that, like a CJ West or Darius Alexander, that, even in a rotational role as a rookie, that can come in and start taking some snaps at either position and kind of be what I think everybody wanted Zach Pickens to be, to be able to have that. And then they can come in and take over for Andrew Billings, at some point once he becomes a little bit too old or, too expensive.
Yeah. So another one, obviously another move this week, Khari, was the no more Jack Sanborn, which made a lot of people sad.
Yeah.
But how does that change things when it comes to your expectations of a Dennis Allen defense and the role that could add, or the lack of not having that Jack Sanborn? Because behind that is a Noah Sewell, and I'm not quite sure we've seen enough at all to think that he could come up and play that part.
Yeah, I think that linebacker, and this is something I've talked with a couple of people with, that linebacker is sort of a sneaky position that the Bears need to address
Mm-hmm.
because, you got TJ Edwards going into the last year of deal. You got Tremaine Edmonds coming up on, year 3 of his 4-year deal. You don't have a lot of strong depth behind them. So I could absolutely see them investing higher than people think at linebacker. Now, I'll say this, though. I think the cool thing about a Jack Sanborn is part of why you love him, right? Is that he was, an undrafted free agent who came in and just balled out and played his butt off. You can find more undrafted free agent style linebackers to come in and do that. Guys that are intelligent, that just know how to play the position, know where to be. And I think that more so than, and I know that everybody loves, like, Jihad Campbell, for example.
Yeah.
I don't know that they're going to be doing that
Yeah.
in the first round, but there are going to be plenty of linebackers, in free agency, in the draft, I think, that are going to be able to fit what they need to do. I think you probably need to come out of this offseason with like 2 to 3, linebackers, whether they're rookies, free agent additions, because I think that the turnover from the last sort of regime is going to commence.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's going to hit hard. And that linebacker position is something that we're used to having in Chicago. So when you don't have it, you're like, hold on, what is going on? Final one before I let you go. I just want to get your top 4. Give me your from strongest, like the biggest offseason need now that a couple of these moves have been made. Biggest offseason to need to least. Just give me your top 4.
All right. So biggest need to least. I would say biggest need currently. I think you need another edge.
Okay.
Because I know people are going to say, oh yeah, you got to get another center. Yeah. Okay. But I think that they're going to get one.
Yeah.
I think what you don't have and what you really need right now is another edge outside of Montez Sweat, because it's too easy to send extra attention and take him out of the game. You need somebody who's going to come in and develop into someone. I know for myself, like I said, I like Mykel Williams. He's young. Yeah. I think that he's got a lot of explosive potential, and he can play on early downs already. I think that's the thing that I'm interested in. He can already play against the run, and then we'll see what he can do later against the pass. He showed some disruptive tendencies.
Quick on that. Yeah. Do you see a world where Ryan Poles tries to trade up for an Abdul Carter then?
You're going to have to trade up into the top 3 to make that happen. Yeah. So it's going to be an expensive trade, but I'll tell you this, man. You do that, and we're talking absolute win now. Right. Like this, yeah. This is that's what you're building for. If you trade up for Abdul, and that would just be absolutely monstrous. Oh my God. I would love that. Then I think next on now you got me thinking about it, and I'm like, now I just want to
let's
have
go.
It happen. Yeah. I mean, I've heard some people, I've poked around and said, like, I can't wait for draft time. There's potentially some big moves, and it's like, oh my God. But anyway, I think next on the list, I would say, is center. Just fill out the rest of the offensive line, even that out. I think next I'm probably saying interior defensive line and safety after that.
Yeah.
Now, safety is an interesting one because on paper, right, you got Kevin Byard, you got Jaquan Brisker. Jaquan Brisker and his concussion problems are scaring the hell out of me right now. And also, I think Kevin Byard is, he's getting up there. He's obviously been an Iron Man. He's been on the field and all that. But here's what I say. I think that's more on the downside of needs. Yeah. But there were some really good safety prospects out there. Working out. Obviously, Nick Emenwari is an alien. He's not from here. But you also have a bunch of other prospects that I think showed out really well in that defensive back room. that I think you could get late day 2, early day 3 that could challenge to start right now,
Right.
especially if Jaquan Brisker isn't fully healthy.
Yeah, and I think you have to consider that it's this last year, his season ending with concussions is scary, and you got to be careful with that. And then when he's gone, you felt this magic. I think there were games where I felt Elijah Hicks held on, and it wasn't awful, but it's definitely not somebody that you want to be able to rely on coming in. And where do you see a guy like an Xavier Watts going?
Ooh, see, listen, I really like Xavier Watts.
Me too.
You know, so I mean, I'm a Notre Dame grad student actually, so I still watch a lot of them. That's just an all around playmaker. To me, that's round 3.
Okay,
that's a round 3 kind of guy.
I would
And hey,
love
to be to that point, the Bears have 4 picks inside the top 75. So
yes. Let's go. All right, Khari. Well, I really appreciate it. I know I enjoyed a lot of this, and we'll see as things start to play out. Obviously, free agency next week. Then after free agency, you can really start getting an idea of the needs and where they need to go, and we'll see how that ranking looks after that. But I appreciate your time. Always a good time chatting with you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks. All right, everybody, we're going to continue on some of these recaps that we've had so far in the start of the offseason and then look a little bit more at the draft. Khari Thompson joined me, and then now we have Jacob Infante. Jacob, thank you. I know it's the weekend, so we don't really technically want to be doing this on the weekend, but we'll make it work.
Yeah, no, we make do. I mean, when you hit me up, I was like, okay, I'll make an exception for you. So I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thanks. Let's start with some of the a couple offensive line moves, obviously, and Thuney and Jonah Jackson. Those two, I think, are actually things that may alter what the Bears do moving forward. And so I want to get your thoughts on that. So let's just go there first.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with Thuney because that's the bigger move, so to speak. I think that definitely gives you a guard option, ideally for the next at least 2-3 years. I mean, he's, north of 30. So, he's on the back end of his career, but he, obviously he's coming off a 2 straight first team all pro season. So that's, that should be an instant upgrade along the interior offensive line for sure. I think and then Jonah Jackson, bringing him in, I think it's a, low cost, low risk, high reward, essentially, because he's coming off of a down year where he got hurt most of the year. And I think people are overreacting a little bit just because Bo Limmer, the Rams' new center, was a lot better than people were expecting. And then Steve Avila kicked out to guard. And it's like, you already have Kevin Dotson at the other guard playing at a very high level. You don't necessarily need Jonah Jackson as much. So I think that some people, or maybe at least in the Rams fan base, from what I've been able to see, are a little bit too harsh on him, but it makes sense from their perspective to deal him just because, you have your interior O-line set, save a little bit of money, getting a draft pick as late as it may be. So I think the interior offensive line should still be a priority. I mean, obviously you still need to figure out center, and I think that's something they will do. I'd also like to see them bring in a guard too, in the draft specifically, because, Jonah Jackson, 28. I mean, he's going to start along the interior in 2025, presumably at right guard. And then you have Thuney at left guard and then whoever at center. But say if Jonah Jackson doesn't necessarily bounce back to his Detroit ways, they have an out in his contract where they could, worst case scenario, cut him in the 2026 offseason.
Okay.
So, to be prepared for that, as well as, say, even if he becomes a long-term starting guy, you need someone to be an eventual successor for Joe Thuney.
Yeah.
I think, round 2, round 3 would be fantastic for that. I mean, again, we'll see what they do in free agency. I have a feeling they're going to find a center. Okay. But I think that some of the draft plans are still the same. I just think, free agency is going to be attacked a little bit different. I'd expect 2 relatively big moves. I think one's going to be center, and then I think they're going to make a move at either defensive tackle or end as well.
How much do you think it factored in that Jonah Jackson, like the familiarity, obviously, with Ben Johnson? Do you think that was a big piece of this move?
Definitely. I think so. Yeah. I think that you take a look at it, obviously there's the scheme familiarity, Ben Johnson's seen Jonah Jackson succeed. He was on the Lions staff when Jonah Jackson made the Pro Bowl, and he was he's the offensive coordinator for 2 of Jackson's 4 years in Detroit. So obviously, I think that's something you look at, and you kind of look at it through the lens of, okay, here's a guy that I know. Here's a guy that, has played well for me in the past. We can get someone with high upside at a relatively cheap price.
Yeah.
There's not necessarily a lot of risk outside of, he's a decent price in 2025. That's honestly only the risk that you're taking.
Yeah.
So I think Ben Johnson playing a role, certainly, Ben Johnson's presence certainly played a role in that trade. I just think it makes a lot of sense because it's also not a super strong guard free agency class. I mean, especially once Trey Smith got franchise tagged, it became pretty clear. It's like, all right, that's clearly far and away the best offensive lineman in free agency, and now he's off the board. So that, took a pretty big hit to the rest of the class. And honestly, I'd be willing to take on Jonah Jackson, try him out for a year rather than commit 2 to 3 years to, say, like an Aaron Banks or something where they keep saying his best football is in front of him. But I'm always wary about that because you're paying a lot of money for somebody who's not proven. Yeah. And I mean, well, one, you never know the effects that, getting a lot of guaranteed money can have on a person. But even if he, maintains that work ethic, even if he, keeps working hard, because I thought he was solid with the 49ers. I just don't know how big of an upgrade it would be. And you're paying a lot more money for a marginal upgrade. So I think Joe Thuney and Jonah Jackson it's more than a marginal upgrade. So they're taking on a good amount of money in those trades, but I think that both of them are probably better acquisitions than they could have made in free agency anyway. So I'm on board 100%.
It is funny because when you see a lot of the free agent rankings for guards, 2 of the names that pop up are 2 names that are already on. One's on the Bears and one's on the Jags, who I cover, and that's Brandon Sheriff and then Tevin Jenkins are 2 of the names that are on there. But I think both of them, number one, Brandon Sheriff's definitely towards the end of his career. So to me, that would be just definitely if you need to patch something up to get through the year type of move, in my opinion. Yeah. And then Tevin, it's interesting, and that was a lot of people's argument with the Jonah Jackson thing is why would you go get someone who's had these injury issues, but when you have a guy who's good but has injury issues in the Tevin Jenkins situation. So I know that was a lot of people's argument, but I think that's why I went to that Ben Johnson part of it. I just really think that Ben Johnson had a lot to say of, hey, when I was able to have this guy, he was able to be a Pro Bowler, which obviously makes a big difference into what the Bears have had when it comes to the coaching, the offensive line, and some of those issues. But let's talk about the draft names that you like. I think the 2 top ones that everybody's going to be talking about are Will Campbell and Armand Membo. Those 2 names are the offensive linemen sitting at the top. Do you see any world where they drop to 10?
I could see one of them going. I don't think both of them are there. I think that's going to depend because I keep looking at 2 teams in particular. That's the Patriots at 4 and the Jets at 7, who could go offensive lineman early. And I think that Will Campbell's a little bit more pro ready, a little bit more polished, and Membo's got the, elite physical talent. He's got the, untapped potential sort of deal. And, he improved significantly from 23 to 24. And watching, as a Mizzou fan, getting to see how big of a role he played in that offense this past year was, something special because he always had the tools, but he just really put it together. So to that point, I'd say probably one of them will be there just because I'm looking at it from the first 4 picks. I think the Patriots have a really good chance to take either Travis Hunter, the cornerback wide receiver from Colorado, or Abdul Carter, the edge rusher from Penn State. I think one of them will be on the board. Especially if you have, assuming a quarterback is either the first or second pick, whether it's, the Browns taking one, the Titans taking one, or maybe a team trading up to number 1 with the Titans and then taking Cam Ward or even Shedeur Sanders. I think the dream scenario for the Bears is you get 2 quarterbacks within the first 3 picks. I think that's the dream because that makes it, at least in my opinion, a little less likely that the Patriots go offensive line in round 1. I mean, I'd say that's their biggest need.
Yeah.
But I think that there's slightly better value with a guy like Carter or Hunter at 4. So if that's the case, then, there's always the chance the Jets do something. Maybe if the Titans trade down, they could want to add another offensive lineman. But I mean, they've added J.C. Latham and Peter Skoronski the last couple of years in the first round. Maybe they want to, divert their attention somewhere else, even if they do trade down. So I think there's a chance one of them's there at 10, and odds are that would be my selection, either Campbell or Membu. The sort of deal where I think you start him along the interior, and then if you don't retain Braxton Jones, then that can be your starting left tackle. And with Membu especially, that's a big projection because he's been a right tackle the whole time at Mizzou, not a left tackle. But I mean, teams do that. I mean, going back to the Titans, the J.C. Latham, they did that with him where he was a right tackle at Alabama. They moved him to left tackle in his rookie year. So it's not unheard of. So if one of them's on the board, that's probably one of my stronger, probably one of the guys that I'm going to bat for the most.
Yeah, and I think that it's funny because I feel like everybody complains if they see that mocked to the Bears, but they complain all year about the offensive line. And then when it comes to drafting an offensive lineman, Bears fans just get upset about it. But sometimes, I mean, we've seen it when it comes to the Darnell Wright, and people still complain about taking Wright over when Jalen Carter was there. But I do think at some point, I can't imagine what our line would look like if we didn't even have Darnell Wright. We would truly need an entire new offensive line. Yeah. So at least there's that there. So let's say both of those guys are gone or the Bears don't go that route. What is your next guess at what they would do at 10?
So, I mean, I'm assuming also that Mason Graham, the D tackle out of Michigan's not there because he's someone that I really like. I just don't think he's going to fall to 10 at this stage. Honestly, I mean, my top choice if those guys were all gone would be to trade back. And I know I say that with a caveat where it's always easier said than done. In this draft class, which is seen as a little bit weaker than some past draft classes, you might not have as competitive of a market to move up to number 10, but if you can, I think it'd be great to stack up on, maybe another day 2 pick, like a second or a third rounder, move back a couple spots depending, and then take a defensive lineman. But if you're sticking at 10, I'd consider Ashton Genty. Okay. I wouldn't jump to it right out of the gate. I mean, obviously, I think you need to have center addressed. Yeah. So say if you do sign a Drew Dalman, the Falcons center in free agency, and you have your starting offensive line for 2025 set, then I'd be fine with taking Genty because off of pure value, he's probably the best player on the board at that point if he's still available. And you have a good O-line set, at least for 2025. So if not for longer than that. So I'd be cool with that. I also really like some of the defensive linemen in this class, D tackle especially. I like Walter Nolan a whole lot out of Ole Miss. I think that he took a big step in 2024, and there's a lot of raw physical talent with him. The play strength, the athleticism, and his hands got a lot more polished. Kenneth Grant is a really good run stuffer who's also a freak athlete for a guy who's like 330 pounds. I realize I'm higher on him than most. I feel like the consensus is like a late first round pick for him. I'd take him as early as 9 or 10. That's just me personally. Like I see a Dontari Poe type. I think it was like Ben Fennell or something who tweeted that out. And that's I've been on the Dontari Poe, Kenneth Grant train for some time. So I'd be a really big fan of that as well as well. There are other edge rushers too, like James Pierce Jr. is a little bit interesting because he doesn't have the long arms and the pure size that Dennis Allen historically works with the defensive end, but he's also a freak athlete, flexible turning the corner, great hand usage, deep set of deep toolbox of pass rushing moves. And then Mikael Williams too out of Georgia is someone I'd be interested in because that's a guy who fits that Dennis Allen mold a little bit better. He's not as polished as James Pierce, but he's a lot bigger, he's a lot longer, he's a lot stronger, and he's still a really good athlete. So I'd say those are just a couple of guys that I'd consider at 10. In a dream world, like, well, not a dream. In a dream world, you get Campbell, Membu, or Graham.
Yeah.
The next
dream world.
The next dream world over is you trade back from 10 and, you pick up on some more day 2 picks. But if you have to stay at 10, I think I'd prefer for it to stick in the trenches. The only exception I'd really consider is Genty.
Yeah, how do you feel about a Darius Alexander? Because he's a name I've seen a lot, and I saw a chart someone made that had like it had specifically 4 categories. So it had like run stuffers, all arounders, pass rush specialist, and tweeners. And there was only 2 names in that all arounders that they had, and it was Mason Graham and Darius Alexander.
Yeah, I mean, I think Darius Alexander has been really interesting. So he's a MAC guy coming from the Toledo level. I think initially when I first got into his tape in 2023, I really liked what he brought from a run defense perspective. I thought, okay, this guy's stout. He's powerful. He's got good spatial awareness, knows how to free up his hands, stack and shed blocks. But I think, we saw a bit more development as a pass rusher in 2024. And he's a good athlete for a defensive tackle. I still think he's putting it together as a pass rusher, but he's certainly made some improvements over the course of his career. Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of mock drafts with him sneaking into the back end of the first round.
Okay.
He's the type of guy where I'd be very interested with him as like one of those second round picks.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a sweet spot for the Bears at defensive tackle if they want to go that route with, Darius Alexander being one of the top guys I think would fit in that regard. So I wouldn't consider him at 10. I think, if you trade back a little bit more than maybe, but then I also have guys like, Walter Nolan, Kenneth Grant, Derek Harmon, Tyler Williams. So there are a couple other guys who are still higher on him that I'm higher on my board than Darius Alexander, but still, as a day 2 pick, absolutely. I think he's someone the Bears really need a run stuffer. I think that when Andrew Billings was gone, it became abundantly clear there's a lack of depth at defensive tackle. I also think that Andrew Billings is a better pass rusher, but a worse run defender than people give him credit for. Everyone thinks, he's a short, stout defensive tackle. He's a, run stuffing nose tackle. I think he's better at rushing the passer and generating pressure over the center than he is stopping the run because he's got short arms and it's tougher for him to, so picture like you're locking an offensive lineman away from your frame. It's tougher to win with that leverage with your hands if your arms are shorter because naturally it's like the thing where you, I don't know how to describe it, but like when you're growing up and there's a little kid trying to hit you or something and
someone just has their hand on your head.
Yeah, you just have their hand on their head and they're going like this the entire time. That's just what having, longer arms does in a nutshell. So all that said, though, I know I went on a tangent. I do like Darius Alexander. I think that he's probably more of a day 2 guy than someone I'd like in round 1. But I mean, again, he's, solid production at Toledo, tested well. He's got that raw athleticism to work with. He's a really good run defender. So I think he's someone who's going to start in the league for quite some time.
Let's scoot through a few of these other ones just so I don't keep you too long. The wide receiver, I saw your tweet. I agree with you in the realm of maybe it doesn't feel like it's as dire of a need as some people believe it is, just because, to your point, you have DJ Moore, Roma Dunze, and Cole Kmet, and then what Ben Johnson was working with at certain points in Detroit was much worse than that. You a Josh Reynolds and a Tim Patrick, and so you don't think that if that is addressed, it'll be a later in the draft type of thing, is what you would hope, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, unless there's just an absolutely incredible value in round 2, I'm not considering receiver until the 3rd round or later. Okay. And I think that part of it comes down to just the value in this draft class and what the Bears need. Realistically, with Keenan Allen gone, you're going to need a new slot receiver. And I think that that's the archetype the Bears should target. And there ideally is going to be really good slot receiver value in round 3, like a Jalen Knoll out of Iowa State. He's a speedster who can separate well. Xavier Restrepo out of Miami, not as fast, but a, tougher player, a stronger player, better hands. And then you can go a little bit later down the line. I know he's a little bit more of like a big slot, but I think Pat Bryant out of Illinois could really fit well in that kind of role. Tez Johnson from Oregon is a divisive one because he was the lightest player at the NFL Combine at about 150 something pounds. Like that's worrisome, and he didn't run as well as a lot of people hope, but his agility was good. His jumping was good, if I recall. And the tape shows that he's a shifty guy who could separate and he can make defenders miss in space. So I definitely think that you can go with a veteran in free agency. Like you were saying, like a Tim Patrick, a Josh Reynolds, something like that, someone who has that experience with Ben Johnson, and then just go from there, honestly, and then maybe draft a guy in like the 5th round or something like that.
Yeah.
I think that's the move that I prefer, and then see, okay, we have a competition for the 3rd receiver with this veteran, this 5th round pick with Tyler Scott, and see who comes out of that. I feel confident one of them could at least be a decent option. Yeah. You're not looking for them to be amazing just because, that's the wide receiver 3. They're probably at best 5th on the team in targets.
Yeah.
I don't think that's something you necessarily have to break the bank for, especially when you have the O-line and D-line deficiencies that the Bears have.
Yeah, it's funny that you say the Jalen Knoll one, because I used that name on Helmets and Heels yesterday when we were talking about potential targets for the Jags. But I like both the Iowa State wide receivers. Yeah. It's funny because it kind of reminds me of the situation last year when we were talking about a Malik Neighbors and a Brian Thomas Jr. And so many people are talking about a Malik Neighbors. And I feel like it's similar, where there's like a lot of chat on Jaden Higgins, and Jalen Knowles kind of sitting there like a little bit farther back, but I like him a lot. And when you're talking about where he would play in Chicago, I think it would be fitting. Let's go to, I feel like we need a moment of silence for Jack Sanborn. Is that?
Yeah.
But now, like, how does that change that room? Because I think a lot of people have honestly showed a lot of concerns with Tremaine Edmonds, and now you lose Jack Sanborn, who a lot of people liked a lot, not just because of the person of Jack Sanborn, but what he was able to do on the field. So what do you think that linebacker room ends up doing? How aggressive are they there? Because I just don't see a Noah Sewell being the next guy.
Yeah, I think it's pretty fair to say, I mean, there's always a chance maybe he explodes out of nowhere and just becomes like this reliable starter. But I think that there didn't really show any development from year 1 to year 2. So it's pretty fair to be skeptical, in my opinion, about him ever being more than just a guy, which is fine. But that's not someone you can rely on to be a full-time starter. So yeah. I definitely think there's reason to be concerned with Tremaine Edmonds. TJ Edwards was solid, but he did take a little bit of a step back from the year before. Linebacker, I think that's a position where, again, maybe like round 5 or something, I'd look for someone to compete, but I'm not breaking the bank for one at this stage. Certainly not in free agency. I think absolute worst case scenario, I know they extended Amen Ogbongbemiga. I'm pretty sure I got that name right. I sounded confident saying it, so that's all that matters. Wait until you make it, I guess. But yeah, so you have him in the mix. You have Noah Sewell. I think maybe you're one more guy away, and hypothetically, there's still a chance they can re-sign Sanborn for less than the restricted free agent tender that they declined. That'd be the dream, in my opinion. I think Sanborn's a perfect linebacker 3, but you never know. Maybe there's going to be a team that's going to give him a chance to, be a true starter, because, so many teams only use 2 off-ball linebackers nowadays. So linebacker is not a position. Maybe in 2026, I think linebacker and safety are 2 positions that you could look at as potential needs then. But this year, I think there are more pressing needs, and with the trenches, with some questions at running back coming along, I wouldn't go crazy at linebacker. But if there's a good enough value, I wouldn't hate it. Like say you get to round 3 and someone like Carson Swessinger from UCLA, or Demetrius Knight from South Carolina, someone like that still available. I'd consider it.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be like, oh, I got to run to the podium and get these guys. But it's like, okay, it's good value. This is probably going to be a future need next year. Just get ahead of the curve. So I don't think it's likely they go linebacker early, but if the value is right, I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah. And the Bears social media team yesterday teased everybody a little bit with some Mac highlights. And now there was a frenzy on Twitter of that. I do think most people agree that you would like to see some sort of another edge in some form. Do you think that, first of all, how aggressive do you think they'll be in that light? Is there anything still from like an Austin Booker that you think we'll see more of this season? Or do you think there wasn't enough last year to kind of roll over with that?
Yeah, so I do think they'll be pretty aggressive in the defensive line market and free agency. Probably more at edge rusher, and then defensive tackle. I think they'll get someone to factor into the rotation. Maybe one of the veterans who got cut recently. Something like they did with Kevin Byard, where they got him at a slight discount from what he would have been at, just because he was already making salary from the dead cap on the contract he got cut from. But I think they'll be aggressive at edge rusher, whether it's Khalil Mack or someone else. I don't know. Personally, I'd love for Khalil Mack to be back in Chicago. I think that'd be a lot of fun. At the same time, I do think that there's still a pretty big hole, not just at edge 2, but at edge 3.
Mm-hmm.
And you're looking at the guys who are still on the roster. You don't really have anybody that's proven. And I think Austin Booker could become that guy, but I don't want to hedge my bets on him being that guy because say if Sweat gets hurt or, whoever you bring in free agency or the draft gets hurt, then you're, stuck with Austin Booker. And what if he isn't great? Then that's going to be a big detriment at a key position to your team. So that's why I wasn't a huge fan of the DeMarcus Walker cut.
Yeah.
Honestly, if I was trying to free up cap space, I probably would have, I would have cut Ryan Bates over DeMarcus Walker. But I mean, what's done is done. I think that they still have a need at edge 3, whether it's bring in Khalil Mack and then draft a guy in round 2 to be like his heir apparent or something, like say a Princely Uman Milan out of Ole Miss, or, maybe someone like I don't know. I know a lot of people like Landon Jackson out of Arkansas, Jack Sawyer, Ohio State. Yeah. Something like that I'd be fine with for sure. I think they're going to be pretty aggressive at D-line. Maybe it'll be D-tackle. Maybe they, splurge for like a Milton Williams or something like that. But I think it's probably going to come more at edge. And then you still need to, invest heavily in that in the draft as well.
So before I let you go, what are your rankings of like most need to least need? Is it O-line, D-line, and then what comes after that?
Yeah, so I'd say I'll do like a top 5. So number 1, I'm still going to go center. I think that, some people might argue edge rusher. I get that for sure. I think, historically edge rusher has a higher positional value, but man, I just look at the Bears offensive line over the last few years and I'm like, I don't want to overthink it. There's a need at center. They need to address it. Sure, they already have 2 guards that they traded for, but this is your chance to have the best offensive line on paper, at least that you've had since like maybe 2018 when you had, prime Charles Leno, prime Cody Whitehair out there.
Yeah.
Even then that was a decent unit, but that wasn't like an elite unit. This would have the potential to be better than that even. So center's number 1, just because they've struggled significantly at the position for the last like 5 years. Edge rusher number 2. I think Montez Sweat's a good starter, but you need somebody alongside him. I think Montez Sweat is a tremendous edge 2, but a decent edge 1. So I don't know, what exactly they're going to do at edge rusher. Maybe it's a Khalil Mack, a Josh Sweat, trade for Trey Hendrickson. I don't know. They're going to have options, but I'd say that's number 2. They need someone who can rush the passer at a proven level. Defensive tackle number 3. I think you have Andrew Billings on contract. I think he can be a good starter for like another 2-3 years, depending on, if you extend him when his current contract's up. But you need depth. You need depth, and you need someone who can eventually be the long-term guy, ideally along with Javon Dexter for a long time. But, it's still, I think, a little early to say that. But the depth really, the lack of depth really stood out to me in 2024 once Billings got hurt, and it really hurt the run game. It stalled the pass rush significantly. So that's going to be number 3. Number 4, I'm going running back. I think that, I had to check to make sure I was counting right. I forget how to count sometimes. Running back, I think DeAndre Swift had a solid year, but they paid him to be more than solid. And I think that if you're paying big money to a running back, you're paying them to create. And I think that Swift just took what the offensive line gave him. Granted, I don't know if there are a ton of running backs who can create like that, like a Saquon Barkley, a Derrick Henry, or anything like that. But that's why I, typically prefer to go cheaper at running back, unless, proven otherwise. But I do think that they're going to end up needing another running back into the mix. Roschon Johnson's a fantastic goal line back, but from, when I think you need someone you can reliably trust on when you need to pick up 4 yards, when you need to pick up 5 yards or something. Swift has the ability to break free for big gains. I love him on screens. I think that's something I'd love Ben Johnson to utilize him more on. But I think in between the tackles, the vision isn't where it needs to be, at least for a veteran like him. So I think they need it's cliche. You've already heard it 1,000 times, and I'm sure you're going to hear it 1,000 times more. But what Ben Johnson had in Detroit with the Knuckles and Sonic, with David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, I think if you could replicate even half of that, that'd be fantastic. So running back's number 4, and then number 5, I'm going to go safety. I think they're in good shape this year. Jonathan Owens, I think, is a good depth piece behind Byard and Brisker. Elijah Hicks, I think, improved in 2024. That said, I don't know if you can go into it saying, oh yeah, he'll be the starter when, if we don't re-sign Byard or if we don't extend Brisker after this year. I think that's something where, okay, you're good for 2025, but with Byard being north of 30, with Brisker, his injury concerns that he's had, I don't feel comfortable paying him a significant amount of money long-term. Like maybe on a one or 2 year deal where you're not risking a lot of long-term. I think Brisker's a very good player, but it's, I think if you're not bringing back Tevin Jenkins, who's had these injury concerns and arguably is better at his position than Brisker is at his, then I don't see them paying big money to Brisker unless he proves he can stay healthy for a whole 17 games and puts together an undeniable year.
Yeah.
So safety, I'll put at 5. There are a couple other positions, I considered, but I'd say safety's 1. Maybe it's a little bit more of a 2026 problem, but I think that's one where I'm going to be interested to see if they choose to address that at all.
Yeah. And I think the positive part out of most of that list, which I very closely agree on them, is the fact that this draft class, when it comes to defensive tackles, when it comes to interior offensive linemen, when it comes to running backs, is very deep. Yeah. And so it's 3 position groups that are timely to where you needed them just in time to where draft wise, it is a lot of names you can get. When it comes to running back, there's still names in the 4th, 5th round that I like that are being mocked. And so that's an exciting thing. Is that an Ashton Genty or a Caleb Johnson or some of these guys that are being talked about at the top? I still think there's a lot that I like. And then the safety room, there's several safeties I like too. Obviously, if you wanted to go high with an Xavier Watts or something, I'm a Notre Dame fan and I'm obsessed with him, but that I don't know how aggressive, to your point, they will be this year. I think that the Brisker injuries have to spark a little bit of a concern, though, with back-to-back years with those concussions and then missing a half a season from a concussion. That's scary. So they do, I think, have to focus on that a little bit. But I do think we all have about the same needs that we feel like are most important to least important. So we'll see. But I do think that if you want to address that edge, to your point, I think it needs to be done before the draft. Not saying that at some point you take a chance in the draft, a little bit later. But if you want a guy opposite Montez Sweat, I think you need to address it in free agency.
Yeah, I agree for sure.
All right. Well, thank you, Jacob. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a good rest of your Saturday.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. All right. We'll talk to you later.